It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So now, just minutes after Ahimaaz stepped aside, the Cushite comes, and he says, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you." And we know that David, he already knew that. And David, he still only has one question on his mind. And so David, he doesn't ask about anything else or about anyone else. He doesn't say, well, how are my people doing? How many people did we lose? Are our people all okay? Because David, he only cares about Absalom. And he doesn't care at all that his son is an enemy traitor, because Absalom is his son. And you have to admire David for that. And I kind of like to think that's the way that God thinks of me. That you have all the rest of the world going on with so many things for him to be concerned about, where he's only concerned about me above everything else. And even when I'm actively in rebellion to him, because that's our God, and he's big enough and he's powerful enough to be concerned with each one of us individually as if we were the only person on earth. I don't ever believe that God really sees us as one big group, where I believe God is obsessed with each one of us as if we were the only one. And so David says to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" And the Cushite, he uses tact here because he was able to tell David that his son Absalom was dead without directly saying the words to him. And so the Cushite says, "May the enemies of my lord the king be like that young man." And in verse 33, it says, "The king was deeply moved." And what deeply moved means in the Hebrew actually means he is violently trembling in his body. And so David, he goes up to the chamber above the gate so he can weep in private. But he was loud and he could be heard. And we can read what he says. He says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, my son, my son." Where 5 times here, David says, "my son." Even though his son is a traitor, it never changed his love toward him. Where David sees Absalom's life as being of more value than his own, and he wishes that he could have died in his place. Where David here, he must at least be feeling partly responsible for Absalom's death, where this was his fault. Because this is the final payment from the sin that David had committed against God regarding his sin that he committed with Bathsheba and the death of Uriah. David had been forewarned that this would happen through Nathan the prophet way back in chapter 12, which at this time was over 10 years ago, where God said through Nathan, "The sword shall never depart from your house because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." Where David, he was told that this adversity against him will come from his own house. And even after knowing all this doesn't give David any comfort. And you have to see that our lives here on earth, they're full of sorrows, with many of them caused by our own actions. Some of them, well, they're just caused because we live in a fallen world. And I don't know, but it crossed my mind, do you remember when David and Bathsheba, they lost their first son, that child born from the adultery of David's sin? where he mourned and he grieved that child before he died. But then after the child was dead, David stopped mourning, where he got up and he washed himself and he ate food. And now you see here where it's totally different with Absalom's death, where here he can't stop mourning uncontrollably. So what crossed my mind is that with that baby, David knew that he would see that baby again. And we know that's what David thought, because that's what David said. He says, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. But here with Absalom, David might be thinking that he'll never see Absalom again because Absalom isn't saved. So he's thinking he might not see him in the resurrection because Absalom lived his life in rebellion, and he also died in rebellion to God. Absalom didn't walk with God. And I know how I would feel, where I can be comforted when someone dies that I love if I have the sense that they're a believer. And I can even be comforted when I lose a relative who doesn't know the Lord if that's what they chose, if they knew about God, but they rejected him where that was their choice. But for a child I raised, for one of my sons or daughters, where I spent my whole life telling them about the Lord, where they know all the ways how God had delivered me from all my trials, and if they don't choose Christ, and if they die as a non-believer, I don't know if it's possible to be comforted. Rebecca and I, we talk about this all the time, because I don't think it's possible in this world. But there is a day coming where we will be comforted, because Jesus, he promises to wipe away all our tears. And when we get to that day, we will never experience this kind of sorrow ever again. Not the kind of sorrow that David is experiencing here, because we will not experience any kind of sorrow. But honestly, I'm very grateful that David had a life of trials and sorrows, because that's what caused him to cry out to God, where we have all benefited from it. Because he wrote it all down for us in the Psalms to give us comfort in our trials. So all these trials that David has gone through, they weren't just for him. They were also for us. Just like our trials are given to us so that we can comfort others. And that's exactly what it says in 2 Corinthians 1:4. It says, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort which we ourselves are comforted by God. All right. So now we have David here, and he's grieving uncontrollably, which is a normal response in this situation. But what's not normal here, and what's not good, is that David, he's not allowing himself to be comforted to the point where now he's neglecting his responsibilities. And that's because David is the king. And though everyone understands why David is grieving, Joab brings out to David a very strong point that David needs to hear, that no matter what David is going through, he has to acknowledge his people, that this is a victory, that we won, and that your people, that they're appreciated by you, because everyone who fought for you and fought for your life is now being shamed by you. Where all these people, they were willing to lay down their own lives and to die to save your life, and not only your lives, but the lives of your family. Because there is no doubt that if Absalom would have won, he would have killed them all. But because of the way you're acting, they're all walking about in shame, as if they lost. And you can't do that. You're making it look like you would choose Absalom's life, who is your enemy, over the people who loved you and sacrificed for you. And so Joab tells David, you better get out there, you better suck it up and speak to the people, or else everyone will leave you, and you're going to be worse off than you've ever been. And Joab would know, because Joab has known him his whole life. And we don't know at this time if David knew that Joab had killed Absalom. But if he knew it or if he didn't, he did receive Joab's rebuke, and he responded to it. And so David, he goes out to the people at the gate. And the people, they all come back to him because they had already left to go to their tents without any thank you or without any, well, really good job, people. Oh, that was great. And so now we get down to verse 9 in chapter 19. And now we have the war being over. And so now the question is, how do we bring back these two sides together again? Because here we have the majority of Israel and Judah who have wronged King David, who actually betrayed him. Or to me, this sounds almost like someone who had an affair where they got all caught up and drawn away by someone younger, who's a little more handsome, someone who made wonderful promises of how good their lives would be together, and they listened to him. And he's not like that old fuddy-duddy king who's out of touch with reality, but charmed them of how their life could be if they only became his. And so it sounds like Israel and Judah, like they're having this affair with another man who is Absalom. And they did that to the point where they actually anointed Absalom as their king. But now this man who drew them away, he isn't there any longer because Absalom, the man who stole their hearts, is dead. And so now how do the people who got so caught up and betrayed their king, how do they restore their relationship with the rightful king? Because God, he wants there to be a restoration of Israel to King David, the true king, even though they were a part of Absalom's rebellion. And that's what the theme becomes in chapter 19, bringing back the king. And so now you have here the 10 northern tribes. They're having a debate. They call it a dispute where the people, they're divided because now the people are remembering that it was David who saved them from their enemies, where they know now that they picked the wrong side when they chose Absalom. They also know that they rejected David and that they actually chased him out of the kingdom. And so the first step for a restoration is for the wronging party, who are the followers of Absalom here, having to acknowledge that they wronged David. And that's what they're admitting in verse 9. And then in verse 10, they say, "But Absalom, who we anointed over us, died in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king?" So here we have the 10 northern tribes. They're talking about bringing back David as the king. But to have a restoration, it's the tribes who have to be the ones to initiate the coming back of King David. Because David, he's not going to force his reign as king on anyone. He's only going to come back if the tribes who rejected him as king, they agree to bring him back. Because David is not a tyrant ruler. He's a shepherd. He doesn't beat his people into submission. And David knew that if he waited too long, there would be more trouble in him regaining his throne. And so David, what he does is he sends messengers to speak to his own tribe, to the tribe of Judah, who were the worst offenders here in betraying of David, because they made Absalom their king in Hebron, which is in Judah. And so what David does is he sends Zadok and Abiathar the priests, and David tells them to tell the tribe of Judah that he's already heard from the other tribes and that they're talking about returning him to the throne as king, but that he hasn't heard anything from them yet, from his own tribe. And David says to them, he says, "You are my brethren, my bone and my flesh." And these are the same exact words that Israel said to David in 2 Samuel 5:1. The very first time that they came to David when they asked him to be their king. And then David says to Judah, "Why haven't you come from me? Why are you last?" And then David says to Judah that he's going to make Absalom's commander, the commander of his army, Amasa, the new commander of his army, replacing Joab. And so what David is saying by this is that he is saying that there will be no revenge. There will be no vengeance toward anyone who sided with Absalom against him. There will be no revenge on my part. So David here, he is pardoning all the officials who followed after Absalom, where he's starting this reunification of the country by making Amasa, who is his nephew, his new commander replacing Joab. And so you can kind of tell that by David doing this, that David knows that Joab killed his son against his orders. And so what this also does, this also unites the whole army again, because David here is giving amnesty to all the rebel soldiers, and he's giving them all a new beginning. And by this one gesture, it says that David, he swayed all the hearts of the men of Judah so that there was no more division. And now everyone wants to bring David back as king. And it's the same way for us. Jesus, he never forces us to serve him. Everyone who serves Jesus, it's because Jesus has swayed their heart. And in the same way, how David has pardoned everyone here and has no vengeance toward anyone who previously betrayed him, when we make Jesus the king over our lives, he also pardons us, and he has no wrath toward us, though we betrayed him living in rebellion to him. So now Judah, they send the invitation to King David to return. And so now Judah, they all go down to Gilgal to bring back the king, to bring him across the Jordan River. And so now there's thousands coming down to Jordan River to meet King David. And then along with those thousands from Judah, you have Shimei, where he also shows up with 1,000 men from the tribe of Benjamin. So along with Shimei, there was Ziba with his 15 sons and his 20 servants. And if you remember, Shimei, he's that one who cursed David, calling him a bloodthirsty man and threw rocks and dirt at him when he was fleeing from Absalom, where David said, let him curse. And David didn't kill him back then. And you kind of got to give it to Shimei because he's brave. And you can see he's influential because he's bringing 1,000 men with him. And he's smart enough to know to humble himself. So he's falling prostrate before David, confessing his sin, begging for forgiveness and mercy. Because Shimei, he knows he deserves death for how he treated David. But David doesn't want to kill anyone today. So he's offering forgiveness to everyone, where he's showing this kind of mercy that he wanted to show to his son Absalom, because none of these people did anything worse than his own son did. So David's not killing anyone today. And so David tells Shimei, you shall not die. And though David, he can find it in his heart to forgive Shimei, Abishai, he's having a hard time with it. Because you have to remember, it was Abishai that wanted to kill Shimei when they were fleeing, when Shimei was actually doing the actual cursing, throwing the dirt down. But now he's wanting to kill him again. So David had to stop Abishai twice now from killing Shimei. Jesus is the same way. He's always willing to forgive any of us who formerly cursed him. And all we ever have to do is the same thing that Shimei did. All we have to do is to ask him. All we have to do is to recognize, like Shimei did, that Jesus, that he is the Lord and he is the king. So David, he's not holding on to any bitterness against anyone, just like we shouldn't hold anything against anyone when we're betrayed. And then finally, David sees Mephibosheth, who David treated as an adopted son. And you have to remember, Mephibosheth, he's the only surviving heir to King Saul's dynasty who was lame in both of his feet. And he was a loser when David found him, where David had given him everything that he had inherited from King Saul when David became the king. And so he made Mephibosheth a very wealthy man, where David, he even gave Mephibosheth King Saul's servants. He gave him Ziba and his sons and his servants. All of that was a gift to Mephibosheth. But when David fled, it was only Ziba that showed up, where Ziba, he slandered his master, Mephibosheth. And what he was saying that Mephibosheth thought that the conflict between David and Absalom, that somehow through that conflict, that he would become the new king and restore King Saul's dynasty. And David at that time, he made an impulsive decision before ever hearing Mephibosheth's side of the story. And so here's Mephibosheth, where he's now had to travel 20 miles as a cripple without any help from anyone, because Ziba, he doesn't have any servants anymore, which would have been very difficult for a crippled. And Mephibosheth, he does this even knowing that Ziba has slandered him to David. Where Mephibosheth here, he's only hoping that there will be an opportunity for him to speak to David personally so that he can confirm his allegiance to David and to deny the lies of Ziba. And once David saw Mephibosheth, he listened to his explanation of how it was Mephibosheth's idea to come to David, where Ziba had actually stolen Mephibosheth's idea and brought the provisions of Mephibosheth to David by himself, leaving Mephibosheth behind. So David, he realized he jumped to conclusions and he acted too quickly, giving all the land to Ziba. And David could tell that Mephibosheth, that he was actually being truthful because physically Mephibosheth, he showed the signs that he had been in deep mourning, where he had stopped bathing or did any kind of grooming. He didn't take care of his beard. He didn't take care of his feet. So it was more than obvious that he hadn't taken care of himself for a very long time. And now, if you're going around Jerusalem like that, publicly mourning King David's exile, that means you're taking your life in your own hands, because that would be making a statement about the new administration, that he wasn't in agreement with Absalom. And so David here, he doesn't have the time to have a trial. And he's also not the kind of man to go back on his word. So David said, there's no need to go into the matter. You and Ziba divide the land, which is kind of David taking the easy way out, where he's forgiving the lies of Ziba, who's right there too, because this whole day is about forgiveness and the showing of mercy. And Ziba, he did help David out, although he lied to get ahead. And David, he had to have been surprised at Mephibosheth's response, where Mephibosheth says, let Ziba take it all, which is basically saying, I couldn't care less about the property. All I care about is you coming back home in peace. And some people, they point out that there's a young Solomon who's standing by, who's hearing his father say, divide the land in half, where they think that this might be where Solomon got the idea of how to solve the dispute about the live baby between the two mothers to find out who's telling the truth. And it says, divide the baby in half. And then we have Barzillai coming to David again, where he heard David is returning to Jerusalem. And he's an 80-year-old man who's traveled now again, 2 times now, 20 miles down to Gilgal to see his friend off, where David here, he tries to pay him back for his kindness for when he provided for him and his troops in Mahanaim. But Barzillai, he says that he's too old to enjoy the palace life. And so he politely tells David that he would just like to spend the last of his days at home, but his son could go, that his son would enjoy it. And then the chapter ends here with all the tribes coming to David at Gilgal, where now they're all fighting over David to bring him back. And so you got the 10 northern tribes. They're accusing the tribe of Judah of kidnapping him, so that Judah claims they have a greater responsibility to bring David home because he's their relative, he's from their tribe. And the 10 northern tribes are claiming they have more invested in David because there's 10 of them. And so now they're all fighting over him instead of fighting against him. And we'll see that there will always be conflicts between the 10 northern tribes with Judah. Next week, we're going to see some of that conflict, where things are still pretty delicate in the restoration of King David being the king.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,